Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, if I have your attention, we have another lightning lecture for you all. Suzanne Schneider is Deputy Director and core faculty here. She is going to give you guys a lightning lecture on the Islamic State. Please welcome Susie.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Now, given the lightning quality of these lectures, I'm really just going to dive in here without much in the way of introduction. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that when you hear the words Islamic State, pie charts are not the things that come to mind. Indeed, the group grew infamous in part on account of its slick media production, from glossy magazines in multiple languages to inspirational recruiting videos. These things still exist, of course, though in greatly reduced quantity, but they do so alongside far more quotidian content. Take, for instance, some of the following images. Any of them? No, not those.
Yeah, we already did that. Cool.
So, taken mostly from the Arabic newsletter Al-Nabat, these images are just as common as the better-known montages of camaraderie and things blowing up. Appearing in every issue, we encounter graphics that report on the Islamic State's operations and successes in various provinces. Go back to the ones in Arabic.
Yeah.
There you go, like this guy. Thank you. Like any other multinational organization with a public following, the Islamic State wants its stakeholders to know what it's been up to, how many suicide operations were carried out, how many casualties the group inflicted, how many armored vehicles and weapons were seized. That this mode of reporting via graphs and data points is more reminiscent of a shareholders' meeting than a theological treatise should not be overlooked. Now, as some of you know, I've been researching the Islamic State for many years, and I'm often dissatisfied by analyses that depict it as a remnant from the past that is variously described as medieval, barbaric, or simply anti-modern. It is comforting to think that they are fundamentally unlike us, that they aim to take us back to 7th century Arabia, that their use of violence, likewise, is a hangover from a less civilized era. Like all comforting myths, these ones are simply not true. If you will allow me to unsettle them a bit in the time that we have together, I'd like to suggest a rather different way of conceptualizing the Islamic State, not as a remnant of the past, but of a harbinger of the future. In a seminal work, the sociologist Max Weber described the state as, and I quote, the human community that successfully claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. The early modern European states Weber had in mind had to wrest the power to be violent from many other contenders, from the Catholic Church to feudal lords and local princes with their own private armies. It was a process that produced the systems of law and order that many of us take for granted. That, for instance, if your apartment is broken into, you will likely call the police rather than trying to track down the culprit yourself. Though there is much else we could say about the question of law and order, and won't just because of the nature of the talk, it is true that this general accord, which has shaped our view of the state since the 17th century, is increasingly contested. On the one hand, we have seen the proliferation of the private security industry, which can cover anything from your own personal security detail to the corporate mercenaries that states increasingly rely on to fight wars. According to research conducted by The Guardian, private security forces now outnumber police in many countries, including the United States, where there are over 1.1 million private security guards as compared with 666,000 police officers. And approximate 75% of American forces in Afghanistan are contractors. And so it's no wonder that Pentagon spending on such services exceeds $200 billion annually. This trend is part and parcel of the type of government favored by neoliberalism, wherein we are continually told that private enterprise can perform core functions of the state better or more efficiently, or in the case of privatized warfare, without much in the way of democratic oversight. Now, on the other hand, and roughly over the same period of time, a slate of what political scientists like to call non-state actors has emerged in many regions, predominantly in the global south. In the Middle East, Central, and South Asia, one of the most noteworthy features in the last 30 years has been the proliferation of militant groups claiming the mantle of Islam, and often directing their insurrection against their own governments. This isn't just the way things have always been, and it's crucially important to understand that we are dealing with a unique period in Islamic history. So I'm going to show you a few data points here that visually represent just how dramatic this trend has been. For example, these charts are all taken from Stanford University project called Mapping Militant Organizations. And all of these data start from 1960 and go to the present. We have here data for Iraq that maps the kind of emergence of various non-state actors in this time period. Jay, can you skip forward?
Sure.
Similarly here, we have data for North Africa, and go forward once more. And here's data for Pakistan, kind of broader Pakistan. So in all of these charts, what you will see is that actually there's not much until suddenly in the 1980s, there is a literal explosion, a proliferation of these groups in almost every region that we look at. Now, the oppositional stance that Islamic militants assume toward existing states would have been impossible without a complete ideological transformation of the notion of jihad over the course of the last century. In fact, the discourse on jihad in traditional Islamic sources is largely juridical, even boring in nature, focusing on questions like the proper treatment of prisoners, the soldiers' conduct, which weapons can be lawfully used, how places of worship are to be treated, and so on. All of the classical commentators took it for granted that jihad was the prerogative of the ruler, much in the same way that individuals are, theoretically at least, not endowed with the right to wage war. Only states are supposed to be able to do this. Contemporary Islamic militants reject this line of reasoning and have argued that jihad is rather the right and duty of each individual believer. Jihad, like much else, has been privatized. Only after this foundational pivot could the widespread phenomenon of jihad against recognized Muslim governments gain any traction. What we see then is two instances of the privatization of violence, where the right of states to be the exclusive user of deadly force has come to be challenged. What's so fascinating about the Islamic State is that the group's profile actually bridges what might seem to be a gaping chasm between Blackwater and your more typical guerrilla fighters. In fact, quite a lot that seems hard to account for becomes more legible if we pivot away from thinking about the Islamic State as medieval and start thinking of it as a multinational corporation, complete with its own franchises, company towns, and a vision of citizenship. Those franchises, for whose allegiance the Islamic State must compete with its chief rival, Al-Qaeda, in a sort of Coke versus Pepsi for the jihadi set, have taken root in Libya, Egypt, West Africa, Central Asia, and southern Philippines, and Bangladesh, among other locales. What all of these areas have in common is the weakness or perceived illegitimacy of the central governments, all of which are post-colonial states organized on national lines. They represent the 20th century consensus that the nation-state is both natural and the only way to erect political organization on a massive scale. While nostalgia for the nation-state is perhaps at an all-time high, who can miss the fact that the actual power of such states is receding before our eyes? We can't even figure out how to tax Amazon. So despite all the language of statehood, the Islamic State is organized a lot more like a global corporate entity than the medieval caliphate. Along these lines, we might think of the territories under their control as 21st century company towns. And as a result of the vast amount of data that is now available about all of us, The present iteration of the company town can in fact be far more totalitarian and coercive than the original. In short, and sorry to be a bit of a downer, I believe the Islamic State suggests the possibility of a rather dark future, one in which private entities of all sorts wrest the right to violence from states. And this is not just a problem over there, but one that will come home to roost. Not to be too tongue-in-cheek, but what exactly do you think Elon Musk's Martian colonies are going to look like?